And from the national headquarters of RT America and our nation's capital, hello again, everybody. I'm Rick Sanchez. Something funny happened today that hasn't happened in America in a very long time. Our news media is making news. How? Well, the big television networks did something today they usually do not do. Behold, they started covering a war. Yep. Where? Syria. A war there that, much like Yemen and Afghanistan and Iraq and Somalia and Libya, are generally ignored. We've told you about this, right? They're just ignored by the mainstream media. Suddenly, it became a top story today, especially on places like the BBC, CNN, MSNBC. To my esteemed colleagues, I say, welcome to the club. We here on the News with Rick Sanchez have been covering these wars on a nightly basis. And let's just say, we're glad you came along. Here's the point. Syria is a big story. It's an important story. It's not just an important story now because the Kurds are being attacked and that makes President Trump look really bad. No. It was an important story last week and last month and last year, while it was being ignored. It was also, you know what? It was also an important story when President Obama got us into it. And it was also an important story when his administration completely mismanaged Syria. So yes, the Turkish army's attack on the Kurds is newsworthy, maybe even kind of sad. And to my colleagues, I say, we are glad that you are now covering this. But you know what else is sad? You know what else is sad? Maybe more sad? The deaths of 50,000 children in Yemen. 50,000 children in Yemen. A war you, MSM, generally don't cover. Or certainly not with as much enthusiasm as you were showing today. My gosh, it was like 24/7, every report live from Syria, right? All day long. See, here's the point. So news coverage is supposed to be consistent. It's also not supposed to pick sides. And there's no more powerful side in this debate, in this country, than the weapons industry and its allies in places like the Pentagon, the State Department, the CIA, the NSA. Those folks, interestingly enough, they don't want the war in Yemen covered. And coincidentally, by golly, it isn't. They do now want the war in Syria covered because they're angry with President Trump for pulling out. And coincidentally, by golly, it is. If you see a pattern here, so do we. And there's more. And we've got it. And this is the News with Rick Sanchez, where we believe it is time to do news again. And now to the questions, those dag-nab questions that you're going to be asking tomorrow. Is the media too cozy with the weapons industry that it's supposed to keep in check? And is Ellen DeGeneres' show part of the problem? Wow. Which other presidents should have been impeached and why? We'll ask a West Point instructor and Army major. And might 10,000 ISIS prisoners be set free? Really? Then what? But we're going to kick off our A block today with revelations that seem to show that it may not be just the news media that is intrinsically tied to the most powerful forces in our government, forces that are linked to the weapons industry, for example, and the corporate and the banking interests. Two things to consider here. One, studies show that more and more Americans with each passing day get their news not from journalists, but from actors and comedians and entertainers on television shows. Two, those actors and comedians and entertainers make tens of millions of dollars and are paid in part by the very corporate interests with ties to the weapons and the banking industry. Put that together, folks. With that said, along comes this. President Bush and Ellen DeGeneres sitting together watching a baseball game. She's one of the highest paid media figures in the history of the United States, and he represents one of the most powerful families in American history, whose administration led us into one of the deadliest and costliest wars that literally has changed the world. All right, let's get this out. all right, from Jump Street, as we like to say. She has a right to sit with whoever the hell she wants to sit with. The people taken aback by the photo also have the right to be upset with her. And the people upset at the people who are upset, they also have a right to be upset. This is America. Everybody's got a right to think what they want, right? So there, we're done with that. So let's move on. Joining us now, News with Rick Sanchez, special correspondent Michele Greenstein. She has information on what may be the real controversy here, which has nothing to do with the photo of these two folks sitting together.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, shows that are so-called entertainment shows, like that of Ellen DeGeneres, often normalize militarism, both at home and abroad. And just like you said, perhaps this is what should be the bigger controversy. So I want to take you to this leaked memo from 2009 from Hillary Clinton's State Department transition team, where they actually identify platforms to push the state's agenda.
Wow.
Take a listen to this. These outlets can create vital support for official policy or pending legislation among key domestic constituency groups, but also create momentum for policy abroad. Now, this memo lists different platforms, and in the so-called woman category, that's right, the woman category, we have shows like Oprah, The View, and of course, Ellen's show. Here's what they have to say about Ellen's show. They said she, Ellen, is a big supporter of Hillary Clinton and is willing to use her platform to help promote the agenda of the new Secretary of State.
So they're looking for useful tools. They're looking for propaganda assets, witting or unwitting, right? And they realize, I guess, that in the old days, people used to look for a Cronkite figure. Today, the Cronkite figures are the Ellen DeGenereses. They are the entertainers.
That's right, which is why it's significant that the Pew Research Center said that Ellen DeGeneres is the most visible gay or lesbian public figure in America. So it makes sense to use someone like this to push an agenda among those who consider themselves left-wing, right, or liberal. Now, I spoke with a woman named Tiffany Fitzhenry. She's an author, and she's often called a Hollywood whistleblower. And I asked her about the difference between, pro-war messaging from the so-called news media and the so-called entertainment media. It's actually her work that brought this story to our attention. Let's take a listen.
It's strange because it's almost virtually the same, except it looks different. And that's what's so deceiving about it. So you're getting passed off as, this is just a movie star, this is just a celebrity, this is just a talk show host, but they're passing off the same talking points. So when I came across that it was Ellen in these documents, along with other shows and other entertainers, I guess I was surprised, but then you think back over the last 15 years, and you think back to all of the different instances of her continuing to sell war vis-a-vis the Pentagon, vis-a-vis the Department of Defense. And you really realize that it's a whole system working hand in glove to manufacture consent from Americans. It's very elaborate, and it is a system.
Now, most of the time, Rick, with shows like Ellen's show, they're talking about celebrity gossip. They're talking about social media trends, right? Not a whole lot of foreign policy. But perhaps that's what makes the pro-war messaging on these programs even more powerful. Let's take a look at these pieces of video. Here she is normalizing people like Hillary Clinton, like Joe Biden, like Barack Obama. And here she also is normalizing militarism not only abroad in terms of obvious policies like war, but also domestic policies like mass surveillance. In fact, she promoted the Amazon Alexa multiple times on her show. She even took it as far as to joke, lightheartedly about the device's permanent listening mode. So virtually every time Amazon has a new product, here she is promoting it. And it's not just product placement, but it's also the normalization of mass surveillance. Now, we can speculate as to whether or not this is the intentional strategy of Ellen, but that, in fact, that is the effect that it's having.
That is the most important part, because then it influences the rest of us through people like her. Unbelievable. Great reporting.
Thank you.
Good insight, as usual, Michele Greenstein. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.
There are several polls, including one from Fox News, that shows that by a slim margin, a majority of Americans now favor impeaching President Trump for asking foreign governments to investigate his political opponent. But here's the question. If that is indeed impeachable, which, it may be, what about what other presidents have done? Joining us now is Major Danny Sjursen. He is a retired U.S. Army officer, was an instructor at West Point. He did tours of duty both in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is a man who can talk about the fact that our U.S. military may be somewhat overextended. I say maybe with my tongue firmly placed in my cheek. Let's talk about an article that you recently wrote for TruthDig, where you say, impeach all presidents all presidents. That's an interesting perspective given what's going on right now in our country. Amplify that for us, would you, Major?
Well, I think it's wildly hypocritical that the Democrats and, of course, their corporate media lackeys at CNN and MSNBC have chosen the Ukraine gate, which I'm sure we'll start calling it soon, as the moment to fall upon their impeachment sword. You know, it's fascinating to me because while the revelations from the phone call with the Ukrainian president are certainly disturbing, or at least appear to be, I'm fascinated that the many crimes, mostly war crimes and unauthorized wars and unauthorized bombings, that not only Trump, but both of his predecessors, Barack Obama, the liberal hero, and George W. Bush, have been doing just as much, if not more, than Trump. So I say impeach the system, not the man. I'm talking about the military-industrial complex, national security warfare state system. Let's impeach the system that allows a revolving door for generals and lobbyists to enter the Defense Department, and that allows us to bomb 7 countries every day, sometimes more, and to enable war crimes in Yemen. Backing the Saudi bombing that has killed over 100,000 Yemenis, including 85,000 children who starved to death. So what I'm saying is that this impeachment is a charade. They're not going after him because what he did in Ukraine was so bad. They're going after him on this issue because he dared to do something truly criminal in Washington, which is to go against the other team's elites, their elites, the establishment figure of Joe Biden and his son.
Let's talk a little bit about one part of this that you just mentioned, and that's Yemen. It's interesting that Yemen should be an embarrassment for the American people, because what our government, our military, is doing in Yemen, which may have caused the deaths, at least according to some of the reports I've seen, in 50,000 children who've lost their lives in that war, most of it by ammunition that has had USA written on it, is not something that Trump started. He did endorse it, but he didn't start it. It was actually started during the Obama administration. And yet when we look at these types of stories, we find the narrative that best fits our party or our ideology. And I think that's what you're trying to get to.
Well, that's exactly right. We can't impeach Trump, or we can't even make a big deal out of Trump's, support and endorsement of Saudi war crimes, because if we do that, we have to deal with the inconvenient fact that Obama started it in 2015, and for almost 2 full years was providing U.S. Air Force refueling, targeting data, and the munitions that have been killing these children and other civilians. So, I mean, I think that's the whole point. We can only point out the sins of Trump that have not been already carried out by Obama and Bush before him. So what we have to do is find the smoking gun that really upsets us, which is when you mess with the other side's establishment figures. For example, Nixon is responsible for over 1 million deaths in Laos and Cambodia, illegal wars without congressional sanction that were held from the people. But that's not what he was almost impeached for. It was when he dared meddle with the Democratic National Committee headquarters establishment. Now, I'm not saying that wasn't a crime. I'm not saying that wasn't impeachable. But isn't it fascinating that history is repeating itself again, where war crimes get a pass, but, meddling in politics in Washington, that does not.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I mean, some of the things that Nixon and Kissinger did were abominable. Some of the things that President Clinton did were abominable. There's no question the stupidity and some of the things that the Bush administration did were abominable. Same can be said of Obama, same can be said of Trump. Probably the only one who would get a pass in this area would be Jimmy Carter. And yet, you're right. Whenever we talk about those presidents and we find fault with them, it always has something other. It is always something other than the areas where they really did overextend our military and innocent people ended up dying. Closing thoughts.
Well, I agree with you 100%. Look, what we have in this country today are foreign policy dictators, presidents as emperors. And the question is one of taste for the media and the liberal establishment. Do you like your emperor coarse, like Trump, or do you prefer your emperor to be polite, like Barack Obama? But in the end, they're wearing the same cloth.
Wow. You, sir, are a very smart person and a great guest, and I can't wait to have you back. Major Danny Sjursen joining us here on the Rick Sanchez Show. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Hope to come on again.
All right, let's move on to Syria now, where the Kurds are soon going to lose the northern region as they're being decimated by reports by Turkish troops, and ISIS prisoners are now in Turkish control. RT's Rachel Blevins is joining us now to try and break this down. How bad is the situation there on the ground for the Kurds?
Well, the initial reports are saying that after 2 days of bombing by Turkey in northeastern Syria, that they've killed around 24 Kurdish fighters and around 12 civilians. Now, that may not sound like much, but at the same time, more than 64,000 civilians have been forced to flee for their homes.
Wow.
Think about that, 64,000. And estimates are showing that if this offensive continues, that it could lead to affecting more than 300,000 civilians. But at the same time, a spokesperson for Turkish President Erdogan spoke out, and he said that this is all about a border dispute. Take a listen to what he had to say.
You cannot imagine a situation where Americans will allow, for example, a branch of Al-Qaeda or Daesh along the American-Mexican border just because Al-Qaeda there fights against drug cartels.
I wonder, do the Kurds even stand a chance with this onslaught, Rachel?
Well, to put it lightly, no. But at the same time, we have to look at the fact that even though in the United States they talk about the Kurds and they talk about how they have been essential in the fight against ISIS, but even though we've had years of the United States arming the Kurds, they have not given them missiles, they have not given them anti-aircraft weapons or anti-tank weapons. So essentially what has happened here is that the United States has armed the Kurds to fight ISIS, but they have not armed the Kurds to go after Turkey.
By the way, breaking news, we've just been handed this information that seems to suggest that House Republicans, not Democrats, are now going to go after President Trump and his policy on Turkey. They're going to try and slap Turkey with sanctions over the offensive that you happen to be talking about right now. So once again, if you didn't catch that, the information we're getting now is that House Republicans are going to introduce a bill to slap Turkey with sanctions over the offensive in Syria, kind of as a backslap to President Trump as well then, right?
Right, exactly. And it's interesting because Trump actually addressed the possibility of sanctions on Twitter earlier today, and he said that he would be open to that because he said, well, it's either sanctions and trying to go after their economy financially, or it's sending in a bunch of troops and trying to go after Turkey militarily.
It's amazing to watch this happen. By the way, real quick, 10,000 ISIS prisoners that were being held that now are going to be in the hands of the Turkish army. What are they going to do with them? Are they going to let them free?
Well, that still remains to be seen at the moment, but that is the concern, is that Turkey is going to unleash those fighters and that it's going to lead to even more clashes there in Syria after President Trump has already declared that ISIS has been 100% defeated.
Good stuff, as usual, Rachel. Thanks for bringing us up to date on this story that we've been following and we're going to continue to follow, unlike some of our competitors who just discovered this story this morning, which is the reason I want to bring Lionel into the conversation. You and I had a conversation earlier today in the lobby about this. I think you're as troubled as I am to see that all of a sudden the MSM, as we like to call it, discovered that there's a war in Syria. What happened?
And why? First, this discussion is not about the merits of the war, it's about the coverage. And imagine, Rick, that you and I were trying to come up with an algorithm, a computer program, to determine, based upon what we know, your experience and mine, and what we've seen, what do the media take into consideration before they view something as being report-worthy?
Their own narrative, their own ideology?
Their own narrative.
Yeah, exactly.
A little bit of background. There have been roughly, the estimate, between 150 million and 1 billion people killed in war in the history of humankind, with 108 million killed just in the 20th century alone. So death and war have been omnipresent since the beginning of time.
And usually covered big by news media in any country, right?
Sometimes covered big, sometimes covered justified. What are the factors that all of a sudden make this current iteration of, let's say, let's call it mainstream media for the most part, what makes them interested in this? And the media... This
is what makes them interested. The fact that Republicans are blasting and criticizing the president, and I think they're seizing on the opportunity to blast and criticize the president. Am I wrong?
Right. No, exactly. But it's almost as though the war and the deaths and the carnage are irrelevant. It's who's the president, what's the political climate,
I see what you're getting at.
What's the medium for this to grow.
And that's not what it's supposed to be about.
No.
Right.
War should be an absolute in a pure world.
So is news. We're supposed to call balls and strikes. I'm not here to tell you Trump's good or Trump's bad. I'm here to tell you what Trump did and where he may have been right or he may have been wrong, right?
When you go to a radiologist, you want him to say, cancer, clear, clear, broken bone. But that's it. Just the facts, ma'am, to use the old Joe Friday reference. But what we're seeing right now is all of a sudden a new look at this world, Middle East. But think about all that's been forgotten. You mentioned Yemen. Years ago, women who were savage in the Congo. Remember,
we
just go down the list.
Right, the media seems more today than ever to be covering the story that suit their narrative. And I think that's the general consensus from this conversation. And I think you make a great point. Lionel, thanks as usual for joining us. Good conversation. I know you're very astute when it comes to media coverage. And meanwhile, this week, we were struck with the news that one man may have killed as many as 93 people, which would make him one of the worst serial killers in our nation's history. So we set RT correspondent Natasha Sweet to get the details.
The man the FBI is calling the most prolific serial killer in our country's history was known to be defiant with law enforcement. But one Texas Ranger was able to get Samuel Little to open up, confessing to 93 murders while already serving 3 consecutive life sentences in prison. After 700 hours of interviews, Texas Ranger James Holland was able to get Little to reveal the murders he's committed throughout the country. From 1970 to 2005, Little says he strangled 93 victims. It's helped solve 50 cold cases that were short on DNA. Little says he preyed upon those who were prostitutes or drug addicts. In an FBI news release, Christine Palazzolo, a crime analyst, says for years, Samuel Little believed he would not be caught because he thought no one was accounting for his victims. But even though he is already in prison, the FBI believes it is important to seek justice for each victim to close every possible case. Just like 19-year-old Mary Ann of Miami.
Tell me about Mary Ann.
She's what you nowadays they call a transgender.
She's a black male dressed up as a female.
He took her about a mile outside of the city to Alligator Alley, which is covered in vegetation. He shares the chilling details of how the murder took place.
Drug her into the growth back there and pulled her deeper into there's a path. A little path was running somewhere. I don't know where it led it to, but it was running deeper into the undergrowth. It's like Everglades like that. And we ran into some water running. But before we got to the water, the earth was mushy. I turned her loose, and she fell into it face down.
Little confessed to dozens of other murders.
North Little Rock. Tell me what that girl looked like.
Oh man, I loved her.
So you meet this girl, I guess you're at a strip bar downtown Columbus.
I went on my car, and this white girl come out behind the building. And I'm in my trunk. She walked over to me, say, come on, y'all, can you take me to Miami?
Describe the Las Vegas victim.
She was kind of thin, dark skinned, about 40 years old, she was out there hustling. I met her in a nightclub in New Orleans. That's the only one that I ever killed by drowning.
Ranger Holland said the first thing he noticed was Little's intelligence. He was able to remember every victim with the smallest details of the surroundings. He knew Little liked to sketch and asked him to draw some of the victims. Now his wall is covered in drawings showing the emotion of how he left his victims. Holland was able to promise Little the death penalty wouldn't be used against him. With some pizza and Dr. Pepper, he was able to get Little to confess. Now the FBI are still looking to close more cases and are asking the public to come forward with details of cold cases. In Los Angeles, Natasha Sweet, RT.
So think about what she just said. 93 people disappear, mostly poor women, and nobody even knows that they were missing. What does that say about us? What does that say about our country? And let's not kid ourselves, by the way. If this were a woman of privilege, possibly or probably white. She would have been the lead story on just about every newscast for weeks. Google Natalie Holloway. Don, how do you answer the question that I just raised, that how is it possible in the United States 93 women can disappear and nobody even knew they were missing?
Yeah, so we have in general, a bad problem with a lot of unsolved murders. You know, if you get murdered today, there's a 33% chance that your murder will remain unsolved. And we've got a backlog of about 250,000 unsolved murders. And when you add on to that the fact that these are women who lived on the margins, who were homeless or what we call shelter insecure, who were involved in sex work, and were what some people refer to as the less dead. All of those things together created the perfect storm.
Isn't that the real reason that their murders aren't solved? Isn't that the real reason why nobody seems to, I hate to put it in these terms, but really care about them? Because they are at the lower echelon of society?
Yes, yeah. You know, there's a myth that serial killers are these, you know, absolute geniuses. What they are good at is picking victims that they believe nobody cares about. So, you know, with Gary Ridgway, he's confessed to about 71 murders in the 1980s and 90s, and now we have Samuel Little, who from the 70s on to about 2005 has confessed to 93 murders. So, yeah, it's just these women were seen as disposable. I think it's a lot of factors. You know, they weren't investigated vigorously like they would be, as you said, with somebody who might be white, privileged, blonde, and come from a different neighborhood.
Is there something about our society, is there something about us that makes us peculiarly perhaps susceptible to this kind of thing, where we allow people who don't matter as much perhaps as others? And should that bother us? Should we change that? And how?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's kind of like the canary in the coal mine, you know, how we treat the least of us, or what we consider the least of us, says a lot about our compassion. And, you know, also violence against women in general is not something that's talked about. It's ignored. I've got 1,800 women who were killed in 2018 on my list at Women Count USA, and most of those women went for help, did everything, and it wasn't enough.
Thank you for closing on those biblical terms, and for your for everything you do for the women out there who need the kind of support that your organization is offering. Dawn Wilcox, thank you once again for sharing your insight with us. And that is our news for this night. Thanks so much for being with us. Remember to let your friends know if they're looking for a newscast that, well, is not like the other ones and actually covers big stories like wars, and not just because of a narrative. We'll see you again tomorrow when it'll be time to do news again.